Thank you for being here, and you've got 5 minutes to make your opening statement.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here with you on this wintry spring morning. Woke up this morning to quite the surprise in Howell. We were actually in Lake County last evening at the Right to Life banquet in Merrillville. Drove home, got to sleep in my own bed last night, and was excited. We had a Republican breakfast over in Angola this morning, and woke up to a beautiful surprise of a wintry, snowy morning. But it's great to be here with you all. One of the fastest growing communities in our state, one of the strongest Republican counties in our state as well. And so I think it's important to be here. And so I really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation to be here. For those of you that don't know, I grew up on a farm in northeast Indiana in the small county of LaGrange County, small town of Howell. If you know where Shipshewana is at, just next door to Shipshewana. And I grew up there working on our family farming operation. My dad always told us boys that if we didn't get out into the fields and out into the tractors, that he was going to go into dairy farming. And so we knew that we didn't want that. And so we got going. And it was a great experience for us. We, of course, grew up together, learning a lot of important life lessons on the farm. And then my wife, Christy, and I, we were married in 2000. And in 2001, our oldest son, Peyton, was born. You may want to guess where Peyton got his name, but we were a little bit of football fans. And so he was 3 weeks old when 9/11 happened. And that was the time when we all, of course, were affected deeply by what had happened to our country. And for me, being a young father and not knowing what the future was going to hold for Peyton, I felt that I needed to do something. And I decided that I would get involved in our local Republican Party. And one evening we were at a precinct committee meeting, and afterwards the judge's wife came up to me and she said, "Well, Marlon, why don't you run for a state representative seat? We're looking for a candidate." And I said, "Oh, ma'am," I said, I've never run for office before. I have no idea what I would be doing. I'm completely green to politics." And she said, I said, "Well, what I'll do is I'll tell you this. I'll go home and I'll talk to my family about it. It obviously affect our farming operation." I said, "I'll get back with you in a couple of weeks because we want to talk about it and pray about it." She said, "Well, actually you have until tomorrow at noon to file." And so we found ourselves driving to Indianapolis to file for a state representative seat. And at that time, oftentimes we find ourselves wondering, does anybody else think the way that I do? And that was me at that point. And I was encouraged after campaigning around our district and around our community to know that many other people felt the same way that we did, that we wanted a strong country, we wanted a strong state, we wanted to provide for our families and to find new opportunities and to live the American dream. And especially after 9/11, our country had come together to unite, to defend our country, to fight against terrorism, and to also make sure that our country was headed in the right direction. And so I served in the Indiana State House for 6 years and then in the Indiana State Senate. And that was where I learned that there is a difference in policy that's passed when you have the right type of leadership, especially now being in Washington for the past 5 years. And this is one thing that I would share with you, that I am optimistic about the future of our country if and when we elect the right type of leadership for our country. I served in the Indiana State House with Jeff Thompson, and I got to know Dick and others. In both the House and the Senate, we had strong conservative leadership, people that were willing to make tough choices in a very difficult circumstance. And of course, Governor Daniels came into office in 2004. And there was a difference between the previous governor and Governor Daniels, and a person who was willing to tackle the tough situations that we were facing at that time. We had $1 billion deficit. We turned things around, and the legislature actually gave Governor Daniels a budget that balanced in 2 years. Governor Daniels balanced it in 1 year. And so that shows you that if we have the right type of leader in office, that things can change. Well, in Washington, we don't have that sort of leadership. We don't have a president who's willing to work with Congress. In fact, there's not much communication between the two. And we don't have a legislature that is willing to push the policy forward to make sure that the American people know where the roadblock is, and that it's down at the White House. And then we, of course, have a Supreme Court that continues to be more and more powerful. Congress is weaker today than it has been in a long time, and I continue to fight those fights on conservative principles, common sense, and family values in Washington, D.C. And as I run for the Senate, those are the same values that I'm running on in this election. So thank you again. I look forward to the questions.
All right, thank you. You know, Washington is variously described as a quagmire and a swamp by most politicians from Indiana that go there. And yet, after a while, they seem to disappoint us anyway. And they say, well, we kind of need to work with the system and get along. You're not one of those people. Do you want to tell us your creds about working in Washington and what you did and didn't do?
You know, that was something I was excited about when I went to Washington, is the fact that we have members of Congress from all over the country, senators, these folks that have served our country for some time in a variety of different backgrounds. And what I saw here in Indiana is we had leadership and we had people working together to fix problems. And one of the things that I learned growing up on a farm and working on a farm is that when something is broken, you have to fix it for you to be able to keep moving forward and get the job done. And when I got to Washington, I was surprised and actually very discouraged, actually. It was worse than what I thought it was. The budget situation is very dire. We're now facing $19 trillion of debt. The Congressional Budget Office came out. Congressional Budget Office is bipartisan, or nonpartisan, I should say, and put out a report a couple of weeks ago that gave us the projections and showed us where we're headed on our fiscal track, and we're headed towards $30 trillion of debt in the next 10 years. The interest on our debt is going to surpass what we spend on our military in 1 year in about 6 to 7 years. So the budget situation is just very dire and very discouraging. And what I concluded, Rob, was the fact that you can go to Washington and you can pass bills, or you can go to Washington and realize that the system is broken, and that for us to fix the problems that we face, we're going to have to fix the system. We're going to have to do an overhaul on the motor. We're going to have to get back to what I believe is a system that does work. We did this, I found this here in the Indiana State House, where you have bills that go to committee. They come through committee. They go to the floor of the House. You have second reading amendments. Any member can offer a second reading amendment if it's germane to the bill. If it's not germane, it is then pushed aside. And then we go to a third reading, we pass it out of the House, and then it goes to the Senate, goes through the same process. That process works. That was what I was expecting and what I was ready for in Washington, but what I found was a very different system. It is a top-down system where instead of the committee chairman and the committee members are empowered to put a product together in committee and legislation, bring it to the floor, and then other members can offer a second reading amendment, happens very, very rarely. And so that's why the product that we're passing, that is being passed in Washington, is not what the American people are expecting and what is best for America, because very few people are actually making these decisions. And so I concluded that for us to get our country back on track, something else has to change. I could pass a bill, but it doesn't go anywhere in the Senate. The president doesn't sign it. Well, for us to get both parties working together, you have to have this process, this regular order that we call it, working in both the House and the Senate. And so a couple of the experiences that I had was, in particular, the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is obviously very important to Indiana. Me being one of the very few farmers in Washington, I sat through committee and realized that this process was not, again, working. They were using the Farm Bill to pass a food stamps program, which took up about 80% of the entire Farm Bill. So to me, I was, first of all, aggravated that they were using farmers' name to pass a welfare program, and that Farm Bill has now become a $1 trillion spending bill. 80% of it goes towards food stamps, 20% of it goes towards ag policy. And they were trying to pass it out of committee, and I kept telling our leadership, this is one that's going to fail. People are tired of this sort of spending, and it got to the floor of the House, and it did fail. And I had been pushing for us to separate the bill all along. Well, once it failed, then we went back to, okay, let's split it. So we did split it. We passed it out of the House of Representatives. It went over to the Senate, and the Senate put it back together again, and ultimately it passed that way. But what's happened now is the chairman of the Ag Committee has said He does not believe that we can pass the next farm bill with them together and that they're going to have to be separated. And that's where we're going to get better government. We're going to get more transparency, and we understand where our tax dollars are going. And so oftentimes budget bills come to the very end of the deadline, and that's when the media starts talking about a government shutdown, or maybe we're on a debt ceiling vote and everybody's saying, oh, the sky's gonna fall. But they use those moments, those 2 moments, to pass bills, and they push everything in there that is germane or not germane to the issues at hand, and pass these big omnibus bills. And that's where I think we're getting bad government, because we continue to allow the system to be broken rather than changing the people. That's what I finally concluded, and why I voted against John Boehner for Speaker this last time, was because I felt that we needed new people who were going to respect the process and let it work from the bottom up rather than the top down.
So you have been a bad boy. Now, we have a unique position where both of the candidates for the U.S. Senator position from Indiana are currently representatives from different districts
Correct.
from Indiana.
Yes.
So as candidate Young is not here to talk about his suitability or his track record, would you like to address that? Was he part of your coalition and your efforts to bring more transparency and clarity and reform in government, or was he not?
Well, it seems to be a leading question, but but no, he was not. He was not a part of all of this. And this is where I first of all, back to the bad boy comment. Growing up, I was always a good kid. I mean, my parents had me in church. I went to camp in the summer. I never was in detention. I always worked hard. I was never a bad kid. And then now I get to Washington, and apparently I'm a rebel. But if being a rebel in Washington means standing with the American people, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But you know what? To address your remarks, there's a lot of folks who have been elected, even since in the 2010 class, where we had this huge wave of members elected across the country who were sent to Washington to stop President Barack Obama. And in 2014, we elected the Senate. Republicans now have control of the Senate. The Senate is much more difficult to pass bills, and I'll address that later on. But when the people that we send there all of a sudden just fall into the system, I think that's what's the difference, is we have to recognize my experience in the State House has been a huge benefit to me to realize that the system is not working there and is broken. Now, you can just go along to get along, but we have this entire system that's even been created in the party infrastructures as well, where if you want to be on a certain committee, you have to vote a certain way. If you want to have help in your campaign, you have to do certain things. Now, look, I understand that this is a team sport. We need to be working together, but when people are forced to do things that go against what their beliefs are and what they feel is best for the country, then we have to stand up and say, I disagree with this. I don't think this is the best route. Again, like I said, Indiana Republicans have shown leadership and have done well for our state. And if the Indiana State House were in Washington, D.C., in the United States Capitol, our country would not be in the problems that would not be in the situation that we're in today. We need just more common sense, but also a backbone, and that's where I've decided that I'm going to be a voice, to stand up, and even if it means opposing our own leadership when I think that our own leadership is wrong. If we are going to hold President Barack Obama accountable, then we have to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable, first of all, to be able to have the credibility to go fight those that we think are wrong and leading the country in the wrong direction.
One of the most vivid images for me of the last 4 years was the White House all lit up in rainbow colors. The administration is hardly neutral. They're so seriously biased, it makes one wonder. I just read a story that said it's going to be a criminal act to refuse to rent to someone with a criminal record because it's presumed that the criminal justice system is so slanted that it's really, checking a criminal record is really a code word for being racist, because it's presumed that all of the people in prison of color are there because of racist tendencies and they're really innocent. And this is all being put forward by the current administration. So we have some serious issues right now in Washington. Specific to the rainbow colors, I'd like you to talk a little bit about marriage and the sexual orientation and gender identity issues, because a lot of that seems to be coming from the federal government and being pushed on us.
Well, first of all, I believe that marriage is an institution created by God, and that it's instituted between a man and a woman. Look at nature itself. This is part of how we, as a people, continue to grow and to populate this great world that God's given us. And I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. While very disappointed with the president in his actions, it's his prerogative to do so. It's up to us as the American people. Are we going to elect leaders to do a certain thing? And I think that's what we're all realizing today, that our democratic republic is up to us. It is up to us who we're going to send to Washington. And I think that we all have to wake up and realize that, are we going to elect a Democrat Party that continues to focus on those particular issues, or are we going to elect responsible leaders that are going to focus on the values that has made America strong, the Christian Judeo values that has made America a great country on both on the economic front as well as the family front. I believe that God has created three institutions: the family, the family, the church, and the government. And all of those have to be in their appropriate role. And when the family is weak and the church is weak, the government becomes more powerful. When the family is strong and the church is strong, the government's going to fulfill its appropriate role. And I think that we've seen the government take more power away from us as a people today in Washington and in some states, not in Indiana, but in other states, that continue to destroy the family unit. And I believe that that's the sort of policies that have to be addressed to be sure and protected, to make sure that America is a strong nation as a whole. A lot of these issues, I believe, are states' issues. I believe in the 10th Amendment, enumerated powers for our federal government. Our federal government has a responsibility of protecting our country with a strong defense, to take care of our currency system, to make sure the post office is operating, but their powers are smaller, or their responsibilities are much smaller, and I fall back to the 10th Amendment, where a lot of these responsibilities fall back on the states. But I do believe, when it comes to the marriage issue, that it is going it is a very challenging issue to our country as a whole, because when people are married in one state and then move, how do we address that? But I believe that that's why marriage should be protected between a man and a woman. All
right. Orientation and gender identity.
Again, this is a place where we have to recognize that there are going to be, when we have issues like this that are pushed on us by the government, and the government starts to pick certain classes over another, what we should always fall back to is freedom, and to fall back on personal responsibility. And there are going to be people that make choices that are different than mine. But I don't believe that the government should take my rights away and my freedom of religion. Our country was founded on religious freedom. Let's go back and look at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. When the Bill of Rights were first drafted, the first two amendments were not the First and Second Amendment that we have today. The first two amendments at that time that were sent to the people was, first of all, one, how were the politicians going to be elected in Washington to the federal government? That was amendment number one. Amendment number two was, how were the elected officials going to be paid? And then the third amendment was the protection of our religious freedom, speech, assembly, the freedom of the press. And then the fourth amendment was the Second Amendment that we have today. And in the wisdom of the people, the American people, they sent the amendments back to our federal government and said, we're not interested in how you get elected and how you get paid. We're interested in our freedoms first. And so that's why we have the First Amendment today, and the first part of that First Amendment is religious freedom. Religious freedom is the fundamental foundation of our country. And I believe that that has to be protected, and that it is okay for those conversations to go on inside our communities and in our churches, but the government should not be involved in instilling and picking who's going to be able to respect or to practice their religious beliefs over another person. And so I fall on the side where the government needs to stay out of these issues and let the American people debate these issues in the church, let us debate them in the community, but ultimately it is for the government to make sure that there is some sort of record and order to keeping family records, but at the same time should not be telling people how to live their lives a particular way, and to fall back towards freedom and freedom of religion and freedom of speech.
Thank you. Now, just this past week, the president claims, and he's arguing for the right to unilaterally decide to put refugee immigrants on Social Security disability, I think. He says he's got that right, and he can skip going through the lawmaking process or going through any other traditional process. It seems almost anything he decides he's got the right to do, he tries to do, and it seems like the houses of Congress just roll over. That's what it seems like to us. Now, you've been in the House of Representatives, and you're moving towards, you're running for Senate. How can this be stopped? I mean, is it going to take both houses to stop it, or can he be stopped? I mean, he's only got a few months left, but
right.
I mean, he's setting precedents for next presidents.
That's right. Well, that's why the presidential race is such an important one, because in my opinion is that if Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders were elected to be the next president of the United States, they're going to push this country even farther left than what the President Obama has, because they are going to want to establish their legacy as well and push the country further to the left. The House and the Senate could stop the president on these issues, and it's been a sense of frustration for a lot of us because the House and the Senate control the purse strings for the federal government. Now, it's much easier to do to pass bills in the House than it is to pass bills in the Senate, and this is the issue that I believe needs to be addressed and changed in the United States Senate. In the House of Representatives, it only takes 50% plus one to pass a particular piece of legislation. In the Senate, it only takes 50 plus one to pass a particular bill, but because of the procedural processes in the Senate, there is a vote called the cloture vote. And now, we do not have these same sort of votes in the House and the Senate here in Indiana, but we do in the United States Senate. And what the rule is designed to do is to require that 60 members of the Senate will vote to proceed on a particular issue, and then once the debate is done, vote again, and 61 members actually have to vote yes to stop the debate. Well, if you don't have a complete majority of 60 members in the Senate, which neither party has not had except for a very brief time in 2009 when Democrats had 60 members, I do believe it is 60 votes, not 61. It's 60 votes in the Senate. Democrats had 60 members, and then Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts passed away. Then they had 59, and were not able to get to that cloture vote with strictly just the Democrat Party. Then, of course, we know that Scott Brown was elected in Massachusetts, and they had to force Obamacare through under another rule called reconciliation. So this rule in the Senate is basically used to stop any particular legislation from moving through the process on a partisan basis, because we need at least 6 Democrats to join 54 Republicans to get to that 60 vote threshold. Now, this rule came into by rule after Woodrow Wilson was president. It is not part of the Constitution. It is not part of statute. It is just simply a rule of the Senate. I believe that this rule has to be reformed, changed, maybe even eliminated in some cases, where you don't have to have 54 Republicans and 6 Democrats to move forward on debate or to shut debate off. Now, this gets it gets very technical, but what it does do is it gives a lot of control and power to Harry Reid as the minority leader when he can stop anything that the majority party wants to do. We don't have the same rules in the House or Senate. We have some forms of them, but it should be hard to pass a bill, but it should not be impossible. And that's what's happened is the Senate has made it nearly impossible to pass bills out of the Senate. Now, I think we should at least take the cloture vote off of budget bills so that the Congress can pass a budget bill through both the House and the Senate and put it on the president's desk and leave it to the president. That would be one step we could do. Harry Reid, remember, he took the cloture vote off of judges when judges were nominated to the Senate during their last year when they were in control in the Senate. So this has already been done, but Mitch McConnell went and put the rule back into place after Harry Reid had adjusted it. And I think he should have left it alone because the cloture rule is holding the Senate back from accountability to the people. Let's, for example, quickly, if Democrats passed Obamacare and Dodd-Frank in 2009 and 2010, if the senators in the Senate would have been held accountable to the American people for having to vote for or against it outside of a cloture vote, they would then have to look, they would look at this differently. I think if you'd ask Senator Thompson or Representative Thompson, they would tell you the same thing. If you're hiding behind a procedural vote, it's one thing, but when you're actually having to vote on the bill, then it's you look at it differently. And I think that that's why that rule should be changed so we can get to these very important issues. And I know I've wandered away from the question a lot, but that's a major part of the problem in Washington is the process, the system is broken, and therefore we can't get good policies passed.
Is part of the broken system repairable through an Article 5 amendment process?
I am open to that. I think that it is, I don't think Washington is going to fix itself. And so I have supported, I've always been more agnostic to term limits for legislators. But at this point, I don't see how Washington is going to fix itself. And when we're at $19 trillion of debt, careening towards $30 trillion of debt, something has got to change. And I think term limits can be part of that solution, or an Article 5 convention as well, because the states are going to have to fix Washington, D.C. It's not going to fix itself.
Senators, the Senate specifically is charged with appointing Supreme Court justices.
Mm-hmm.
We have one, and it sounds like nobody believes it's the Senate's responsibility to really make that decision, to confirm or not to confirm that they really are supposed to rubber stamp it. Of course, that's diametrically opposite to the way it was when the Republicans held the presidency. But what's your feeling? How should this be handled? Should we hold off until after the election and then decide what to do?
Well, the president has the prerogative and the right to nominate a Supreme Court justice to fill the vacancy of Justice Scalia, and the Senate has a responsibility to confirm or not confirm a particular judge. They are now deciding not to confirm a judge.
Right, but
and
if they take a weekend off, can't he say, "Oh, they're absent, I can just complete it"?
No, because they're in session, and so he can't make that appointment. In fact, the president has lost Supreme Court decision about when Congress is out of session and nominating. He nominated several members to the National Labor Relations Board, and the Supreme Court ruled that he could not do that when Congress was out of session. With the Supreme Court vacancy, this is a big deal, and the president would never get away with that. With his nomination, the Supreme Court, or the Senate, is going to make a decision, and so far they are deciding not to do hearings, not to confirm, and so they are making a decision, and I applaud their decision, because this is a unique situation where the American people can participate in this process. This doesn't happen often. In fact, I can't remember, it's been well over 100 years since there was a vacancy during an election process. So in this particular case, because we have the most liberal president this country's ever had, moving, no doubtably nominating a moderate to liberal judge to the Supreme Court, we know that the court will then be swung to the left because Justice Scalia was the constitutional conservative. So let's let the American people speak and elect a president, elect the Senate, and then after the election, we can go through the process, and then the American people would have been a part of the process rather than ignoring their position on the matter.
All right, very good. What is your position on the whole refugee process? How they're coming in, how they're being vetted? Yeah,
I believe in strong borders. We again continue to see the problem escalate because we're not securing our borders the way that we should. This problem is only going to continue as long as the executive branch on both sides, on both parties, have not followed the law that was passed back in 1985. Whatever it takes to control the border, if it takes a wall, build a wall. If it takes more border patrol, put more border patrol on the border. We have to know We have to know, in this day and age, who is coming in and out of this country. And our nation is not going to be safe and secure as long as we don't know who's coming in and out of the country. Now, are we going to be correct 100% of the time? No. But we have to at least make that effort to make sure that we are doing everything we can to keep this country safe. One terrorist only has to get lucky one time, and hundreds of people could be dead. And that's why it's important for our federal government to control the border, to know who's coming in and out of the country. I use the comparison that we should have a high wall and a wide gate. And many of our ancestors came into this country illegally. Mine came in from Switzerland and Germany, and they came here for religious freedom. And I think that is important to respect them and those who have come here legally into our country. I would say this: I think it has to start with the borders first, and then after that we can deal with those who are inside the country that are here illegally. But I don't think anyone who is here illegally should ever have United States citizenship. There can be other legal processes, but they should never be allowed to have citizenship while in the country if they're here illegally. One
last question on national defense. Where do you stand?
I'm a defense hawk. I'm a budget hawk. I believe that our number one constitutional responsibility is to defend this country. If you look at the budget, the defense of this country has fallen off the priority list. Our president his ideology has been winning in Washington, where he wants a smaller defense and a larger federal government. And that's been a part of my frustration with our operation as Republicans in Washington, that we have not put a stop to that in Washington, D.C. We have the greatest country in the world. We have the largest and best military in the world as well. But that doesn't mean that we should just sit back and do nothing with our defense. Our number one constitutional responsibility only takes up 18% of our federal budget. So that means 82% of our federal budget is spent in other places. And I'm not saying that we need to just throw more money to our defense. I think it shows you that our budget is out of balance and out of whack because we're spending a lot of other money in other places rather than our number one constitutional responsibility. We need to trust our generals and our leaders on the ground. The fight against terrorism is spreading, and we need to have our men and women in uniform, give them the tools and the training, the ability that they need, and then have a commander-in-chief who's going to actually follow through and deal with these problems so that lives are saved.
Thank you very much. You have 5 minutes to close.
Well, first of all, I'll just say thank you. It's great to be here this morning or this afternoon to visit and to talk about the future of our country. This is a critical moment in our nation's history. Many times we talk about every election being one of the most important elections of our lifetime, and I believe that to be the case at those moments. And this is one of those that I believe is more than that. We have presidential candidates who are running on a variety of different platforms, and I think it's exciting that they're going to be here in Indiana talking about their vision and what they believe is best for the future of our country. But we have a great responsibility in this as Hoosiers, and this time we get to help make the decision. And it shows you that our country is at a turning point, the fact that the election is still ongoing and that we're here in Indiana at this point in the process making a decision. We don't know the outcome of the election at the White House, but one thing that we can determine is that we have a strong fiscal, social conservative who's willing to take strong stands in the United States Senate. 100 senators, 1 out of 100 may seem like a smaller number, but senators have the ability to affect policy in greater ways than what any other office can do outside of the presidency. And I believe that that's why a senator from Indiana that is strong on business background, strong on family values, strong and willing to challenge the status quo and the establishment in Washington. Unfortunately, this is what's happened over the past several decades in Washington. An establishment has been created, has been set up to benefit a few at the expense of the rest of us. And I have found that to be real in Washington. I see it firsthand, and I see the fact that special interest and members of Congress and others that have a lot of power in Washington continue to become more and more powerful at the cost of the American people. It is a shame that the 5 wealthiest counties per capita are in and around Washington, D.C. What that tells me is that our dollars are going to Washington, that they are running through the channels of government and are being siphoned off to the many folks that are in and around Washington. You know, we have to have a strong military. We have to get our Congress back and give them, we have to take the authority that we have to control our budget, to control the purse strings, and ultimately help determine the future of this country. The White House is a critical position. It is one of the the most powerful position in the world, and we need to have a strong conservative leader who's willing to work with a conservative Congress to get $19 trillion of debt under control. I believe the greatest threat to our country is $19 trillion of debt. We cannot be strong fiscally. We cannot be strong for economically and with our military, and ultimately that affects our families. And finally, I'm running for our families across our state. My wife and I have 2 boys, Peyton and Preston, and as I mentioned, Peyton was born 3 weeks before 9/11. I saw that as the threat. Today I see the fiscal condition as the threat to both Peyton and Preston, and believe that it's going to take strong conservative leadership who are willing to go and buck the trend on either side to make sure that we get things turned around, because I don't believe it's too late. I believe if we have the right leaders in office that we can make a difference. So thank you for being here and participating in this morning. I believe that we should be praying, active, and being a part of this process, and electing leaders that are willing to make sure that our country is strong and healthy for generations to come. So thank you again, and God bless.
Your candidate for U.S. Senate, Marlin Stutzman.